Esteemed members of the Reparations Task Force, I am honored and thank you for inviting me to address this body as you consider the issue of reparations for the descendants of the formerly enslaved. I speak to you today as a family historian who has been researching since 19, a professional genealogist and holder from Boston University Metropolitan College's Certificate in Genealogical Research. I have completed and hold a certificate from GeneProof program, which prepares genealogists for board certification in genealogy, and am a current graduate certificate candidate in forensic genetic genealogy at the Henry C. Lee College of Forensic Science at the University of New Haven. Perhaps the most importantly, I also come before you today as a descendant of the formerly enslaved. My personal research focuses on Virginia, southwestern Virginia, in fact, where the Blue Ridge Mountains control the skies. My client work has been broad, but has almost exclusively focused on the descendants of the formerly enslaved from many states. I believe we may all agree that the harms done to the enslaved and their reverberating effects on generation after generation command a repair, a restitution on par with the damage done to all of those before and those who represent them today. It is my hope and objective to offer a genealogist's view of the type of documentation of the formerly enslaved is available, gaps we may encounter in recreating the lives of the formerly enslaved, and how we conduct this research according to the Board of Certification of Genealogists, BCG, Genealogical Proof Standard, known as the GPS. Next slide, please. You can go 2 slides ahead. These insights may enable this body to apply a specific threshold or proof standards of descendancy from the formerly enslaved that will allow the greatest number of descendants to meet the standard. Fueled by television programs such as Finding Your Roots, African American Lives, and African American Lives 2 by Henry Louis Gates, his accompanying book, In Search of Our Roots, How 19 Extraordinary African Americans Reclaim Their Past, and Who Do You Think You Are?, an American genealogy documentary, there is a heightened enthusiasm for genealogy, historical novels, documentaries, television shows, and scholarly works that tell the stories of our ancestors, including those that examine the formerly enslaved. What is not so obvious in these polished and persuasive products is the extensive work required, the dead ends, and the frequent brick walls that descendants of the formerly enslaved often encounter along the way. Next slide, please. To recreate the lives of the formerly enslaved, we use many types of documents, including manifest, property records, wills and probate records, manumission and emancipation papers, and newspapers. All may mention our enslaved ancestors. Determining which combination of documents will produce the best results varies from state to state, family to family, and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There are also several key collections for researching formerly enslaved Americans, including but not limited to the Freedmen's Bureau, U.S. Colored Troops Military Service Records, U.S. African American Photo Collection, cohabitation registers. These collections complement the U.S. federal census records with which many are familiar. About the Freedmen's Bureau records. In the years following the Civil War, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands aided tens of thousands of former slaves. These records are undoubtedly among some of the most revealing about the formerly enslaved. Yet, proper identification of any individual, including the formerly enslaved, requires careful correlation of many pieces of information, as in the case of a Reverend Louis W. Holmes from southwestern Virginia. My mother had known him as a girl, recounted many stories about her and her grandma's visits to his home for dinner after church. With the ready access of Ancestry.com, I quickly identified the Reverend in several U.S. federal censuses and a census of the Freedmen's Bureau. He was not, however, found in the 1870 U.S. federal census. Quick word about the U.S. Colored Troops records. This database contains compiled military service records for the United States Colored Troops. We use this collection to discover additional details about the lives of the formerly enslaved. Next slide, please. Next slide. A word about the 1870 census. So as the debate rages as to who and how we should identify those eligible for reparations, many turn to the 1870 U.S. federal census as a reliable document to identify the formerly enslaved. The 1870 census was the first census to provide detailed information on the African American population only a few years after the Civil War and emancipation. It enumerated over 4.8 million African Americans at the time. For those who have enough information to identify and find their ancestors in 1870, the U.S. federal census of that year is invaluable. There are, however, many descendants who cannot get back that far. Next slide, please. I think I've gotten out of sync with my slides. This is a document that I wanted to show, which is a different kind of document. Lewis W. Holmes, the Reverend that I mentioned, actually was forced to work for the Confederacy as a child and apply for a U.S. Confederate pension. We don't have time to go into the story, but it is a very interesting story, and the outcome is as well. But I'd like to share the case of a client with whom I worked during the summer of 2018. She had known her grandfather, who was born about 1877 in Petersburg, Virginia. She nor her relatives knew his parents' names or locations, which quickly became the focus of my research on her behalf. Her grandfather, by virtue of his age, would not have been enumerated on the 1870 U.S. federal census, but the thought was that parents would. Several documents were identified for her grandfather, including a few which provided his parents' names. Unfortunately, they had first names that were very common, coupled with surnames that were highly prevalent in the region, names such as Peter Smith and Mary Jones. Next slide, please. For this client, and many like her, a threshold of identifying her ancestor in the 1870 census might prohibit participation in a reparations program. So this is an 1870 census which actually has my great-grandfather, who was 3 months old at the time of the census. So I happen to be fortunate that at least one set of my great-grandparents are enumerated in 1870, but there are many people in our community for whom this would be a tall task. So I think I'm a little bit ahead of my slides. Next slide.
You have a minute.
Next slide. Thank you. This is an important consideration if the federal census is to be the main threshold for participation in the reparations program. The truth of the matter is, for descendants of the formerly enslaved, it will take a correlation of several documents to prove their ancestors' identities. Lastly, I'd like to say, let us ensure that each applicant meets the genealogical proof standard, which says that we do reasonably exhaustive research, complete and accurate source citations. Next slide, please. Thorough analysis and correlation, resolution of conflicting, next slide, evidence, and soundly written conclusions, next slide, based on the strongest evidence possible. I encourage this body to consider a broad threshold for participation in the reparations remedy. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to the recommendations of this task force as you lead the way for the nation.